Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. We have Danielle Delage of Wild Coast. What is it again? Sorry.
Wild Coast Performance and Bodywork.
Wild Coast Performance and Bodywork. Even when you practice it, it doesn't always come out the way you hope. And formerly, so you are going through a rebrand right now.
Yeah.
So maybe you can actually tell us a little bit about that to start, because that's really exciting and kind of perfect timing to have you on the podcast and let everybody know.
Yeah.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about that, your rebrand, your previous name, and the evolution into the new brand.
Okay. Yeah, so my previous name was Equanimity Kinetics. And when I started my business just over a year ago, I really wanted to focus more on equestrian, strength and conditioning, and then the equine bodywork and osteopathy. So I came up with a name that, was a play on words of equanimity. But just to include more of those like equestrian related services. But then over the past year, as my business has developed, there's some other sports teams that have reached out for me to work with them for strength and conditioning.
Wonderful.
So I just wanted to expand my business to reach other people and not just within the equestrian industry. So this name just encompasses it a little bit better. And then it's also really personal to me because, I grew up on Vancouver Island and I love the coast, the ocean, the mountains, like all the island has to offer. And so this name means a lot to me in that way as well.
That's wonderful. And I love your new logo, and it's so representative of the island landscape and, surrounding areas, and obviously the things that you're passionate about doing.
Exactly.
We're all so much more well-rounded than people might know if they're only meeting us in a professional capacity, right? And so I think you were saying you really like to kind of get outside and do lots of things in nature. So nice that you could incorporate that into some of your branding and have it feel really personal.
Yeah, exactly.
Excellent.
I love getting out there, and a lot of the training that I do for myself now, like my motivation is to be able to go and hike some of the biggest peaks on the island and just feel good and comfortable in my body to do that. And then also, being in touch with nature is just really grounding for me, and that really brings a lot into the work I do with the horses as well. So
that's wonderful. On the grounding piece, I would imagine, is so important in terms of the work that you're doing, and so much of it is energy based and creating safety for the horses that you're working with and the people. And that kind of segues nicely, because I would love for you to explain for any of our listeners who aren't familiar, what is equine osteopathy and how does it differ from other modalities of treatment that they might be more familiar with, like chiropractic or massage or physiotherapy?
That's a question that I get a lot.
I bet.
So it's really great to open up with that. So osteopathy, it's a really holistic approach to manual therapy. So one of the first things I do when I have a new client, I'll look at the intake form and just kind of assess, like what's going on, not only within the horse's own body, but externally as well in their environment. And then I'll also do a bit of an assessment of that when I get to the barn to see the client for the first time. So it's really taking in those external factors like living environment, social life, nutrition. You have the activities that the horse is undergoing as well, and the people who are handling them. So taking all of that into account and how it's affecting the horse physically and mentally. And then we can look at what's going on with the horse and see if there's any relation between the internal and external factors. So that's always a big consideration, no matter what horse I go to see. And then when we're talking about the actual sort of manual therapy modalities, we're addressing the nervous system, the musculoskeletal system, so that's the muscles in the bones, the lymphatic system, craniosacral system, visceral system. So just all of the systems and how they're interrelated and affecting each other, and how they're part of that bigger picture of how the animal is presenting.
That, in a large nutshell, is why I've become such a huge fan of this modality, because so often we're trying to treat the individual symptoms that we might see a horse suffering with. And so often it's just significantly more complex than we A, understand, or B, have the capacity to deal with if we're not looking at it from all of these different perspectives. Because if they've got an imbalance in one area, it's almost always or almost certainly going to be impacting other areas. And if we're not aware of that, but we're only seeing, the outcome, it really hinders our ability to get to the root cause and actually help them in ways that are going to be meaningful and prevent sort of recurrence of whatever they're experiencing that's giving them a hard time.
Exactly. And as a therapist as well, like I don't like the feeling of just banging my head up against the wall, right? So for me, if I'm just treating the symptoms, that's kind of the feeling that I get. But once you start addressing the whole picture and help the global picture of everything that's affecting the animal, then you start to make progress and you start to see results.
That makes perfect sense. And, with that in mind, like what are some of the issues or imbalances that you come across that equine osteopathy specifically has the ability to help with?
So typically when I'm seeing a horse it's a chronic issue, so something that's been there for a while. And then because it's chronic and it's been there for so long, there's so many components of the horse's body that is then involved. And so osteopathy is really helpful in that way because, we just talked about all the different systems that are important in the horse's body that we can address. So it often ends up being a blend of a bunch of those systems that are involved. So a pretty complex picture.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
And, do you find that it's significantly more complex than most people ever have thought to comprehend or, have any preparation for understing?
I would say it's definitely more complex than a lot of people definitely expect. And, it's funny because on the saddle fitting side, I've been doing this for about a decade and it never ceases to amaze me just how we can end up with a snowball effect of one thing, say their nutrition is not what it needs to be, and then all the compensation that ends up happening in their body, as well as the snowball effect that happens where we see a rapid decline in so many other areas and how that carries over into what typically, when I get called, or probably when you get called, it's people are noticing issues under saddle and, behavioral issues that, are either getting worse or not going away in spite of people's best attempts or efforts to fix what they're seeing, but it's just something that's manifesting on such a deeper level. Exactly. And we know that horses too are amazing at pretending like everything's okay, right? So they don't want to show that they're in discomfort to us. And so they're really holding on to a lot of discomfort before it gets to that level that finally it's showing up, but at that time it's been going on for a while, right?
And I think that's one of the things people don't always understand. Being a prey animal, especially, their survival, they are wired to mask a lot of things and like you said, pretend that they're okay. And it's funny because I think we get so accustomed to how they are with us, but then sometimes if somebody else comes into the picture, they might show things because the other person might be asking different questions or coming with a different energy. They might show things that they're not necessarily showing their owner. Do you notice that?
Definitely, that the horses, they can tell, that you're there to listen to them and to help them. And so, then they will open up.
Which is such a beautiful thing to watch unfold. And, I'm just so thrilled that osteopathy is catching on and that we have more modalities to help these horses.
That's amazing.
It really is. And how can you maybe explain to us a little bit about how the musculoskeletal system, the nervous system, the visceral system, how it's all connected with their internal organs, and then how that kind of plays into some of the tension and issues that we see and how it can ripple into all of the other areas like we've been discussing?
Definitely. And I can even use an example that relates well to saddle.
Fabulous. Okay, good. Yes. I'm such a nerd about that.
Okay, so let's see. Paint the picture. Say you have a horse who's uncomfortable with their saddle, so they're uncomfortable being ridden. A typical response will be to try to get away from that pressure. So they're not going to want to lift up into the saddle, right? Because that's where some of the discomfort is for them. So they'll typically go into more of an extended posture through their thoracic spine. And then with that extended posture actually will increase the sympathetic nervous system activity, right? So the autonomic nervous system is comprised of the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, where the sympathetic is your fight flight. So you get the release of adrenaline, cortisol, you know, the horse is ready to just get away from a predator or a stressful, threatening situation. And then your parasympathetic is at rest and digest. So we want to have a balance of both of those nervous system divisions. They're both always on, but the levels are changing, and we want them to be more balanced.
Sure.
So if you have that extended posture in the thoracic spine, the sympathetic ganglia, which are clusters of nerve cells underneath, or the sympathetic ganglia lie underneath the thoracic spine, just laterally underneath the rib heads. And so when the spine's in extension, it puts pressure on those ganglia. So increasing that sympathetic tone. And then you have the increased cortisol and adrenaline, increased breathing rate, increased heart rate. So it's affecting the respiratory and cardiovascular systems as well there. It decreases digestion, suppresses the immune system. It shunts all the blood to the periphery and the muscles to be able to, you know, fight, flight, run away, react. Exactly. So that already has a huge effect systemically.
Absolutely. Right? And just, you know, to interject for a moment, you know, for riders, one of the things that we hear sometimes is we see an increase in spookiness, you know, and oftentimes it comes with increased risk or prevalence or severity of ulcers. As a result of that, but we tend to see, you know, symptomatically from the rider's perspective, if they're not necessarily noticing those changes in the horse's posture or noticing the change in their ability to lift under saddle, sometimes what they will notice, you know, and I think it's always nice for people to kind of have little things that they can keep an eye out for, increase in spookiness and just, you know, your horse's level of overall global tension. So, you know, we often hear, for me, I often hear people, oh, you know, they won't bend or they just won't do this. And quite often I think they don't necessarily understand that it's not necessarily a won't, it's they sometimes can't. You know, they're being effectively hindered by either their state or the discomfort that the saddle is causing. And it's preventing them from functioning well internally, as well as what we see as riders, you know, or trainers, it's the external functioning that, you know, really starts to become hindered. So, sorry, continue.
Well,
so fascinating.
To build on that, when the spine is in extension, you lose the capacity for side bend and rotation, right? So it's not, when the spine's not neutral, you lose the capacity to move in the other vectors. So, and the thoracic spine where the rider sits, so like T10 to 14 is sort of where you get the most side bend in the thoracic spine. And so if there's discomfort there, then they're not going to be side bending for a couple of different reasons. And then that global tension that you mentioned, they're not going to be moving freely through their bodies, right?
Which makes a huge difference. You know, and even in that area, there's ties within those various systems to, you know, stomach health, you know, and can be, we can see inflammation sort of at the base of the wither that's tied to increase in ulcer or just general discomfort in the gut. And so, you know, the interconnectedness, and not to mention, as soon as we have, you know, that posture being adopted for whatever reason, we're losing the proper functioning of the hindquarters. We're not then able to have that free flow of energy from the horse's engine essentially through the rest of their body. So then we end up with all these other trickle down compensatory responses, you know, and again, I think horses are experts at compensating.
Yeah.
If one thing's not going well, they just, preferentially load another limb or increase their degree of trunk rotation or decrease their degree of hind end engagement, and twist and turn and contort in order to, make the most of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And another super important structure in that area, just beneath the thoracic and lumbar spine, is our diaphragm, right? So restricted diaphragm function means that the lungs can't expand as they normally would. So then we're decreasing the ability for the body to circulate oxygen to the tissues, which then affects muscular function, right? Because they need the oxygen to perform. I mean, all cells in the body do need the oxygen, but for sort of tying it into movement and performance, right? And then there's some really important structures that pass through the diaphragm as well. So we have our aorta, which is the main artery in the body that distributes blood to all the tissues. We have our inferior vena cava, which is the main vein that, returns the blood to the heart to be recycled. We have the esophagus, so again, that ties into our digestive system. Our thoracic duct, which is the main transporting vessel for the lymphatic system, so removing the lymph tissue from the periphery and returning it into the circulation. And then our vagus nerve, which is the main nerve for the parasympathetic nervous system. So all of those actually pass literally through the diaphragm. There's an opening. And so if you have that dysfunction in that area, those are some very, very essential structures that are going to be compromised. And then globally, it's that whole picture again.
Absolutely. I think we're going to need to do more episodes because, I would love to dig in, and we don't really have time today, but I would love to dig into the impact that has, because I think that's something that most people don't have any comprehension of, and it's always so eye-opening. I find the more I know about horses, the more I know nothing, and there's just such complex interconnectedness within their bodies, and everything impacts everything else. So I would love to talk more about that.
Yeah, I know. Going forever. There's a lot to talk about.
There really is. And I really want people to kind of get an understanding of if your horses are being compromised in these ways, what might you be seeing, right? As the more obvious signs that will allow us to say, oh, that might be a symptom of, so that we can start to kind of address some of these root causes and notice issues before they turn into something bigger, right? Because I think that's the hardest part. Like you said, you tend to see people, beyond the acute stage once something's into a chronic illness state or a chronic dysfunction state. And so much of it is about trying to recognize those things sooner so that we can help them earlier before it impacts so many other systems in their body. And before that dysfunction is so kind of locked into their new operating system, essentially. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Because then it's like, more drastic measures, quote unquote, need to be taken. So if a horse is in such a chronic state where globally they're just moving super dysfunctionally and they're in pain, then I'll typically suggest that the rider has to take a few weeks off from riding, right? Because there's no sense in the horse continuing to move in that dysfunction, and they're not going to want to move their body properly with the rider's weight on top of them if they're uncomfortable. And so then it's like, then we have to take some time off from riding, and I have seen really good results in my clients who I've suggested that for, but sometimes that's what you need when it gets to that point. Right?
And it's interesting. I don't know if you have resistance to that, and I suspect probably by the time they're having someone like yourself out, there's probably more noticeable dysfunction that they're tuned into, because it is a challenge. Often I will recommend time off of riding, and you get pushback from the coaches or the riders, and it's tough because we understand that people have horses and are riding because they want to do that, and it's expensive to keep them, and there's a lot of other variables, but I think we don't talk enough about how rest and utilizing proper kind of techniques to engage certain areas or allow certain areas to become strengthened, or just posturally to relax can make such an an impact for them and such a positive
Yeah.
difference in the long run. So it's
Yeah.
such a small price to pay. You know, it's funny, we see people paying huge vet bills and huge GastroGuard bills and huge bills for all kinds of other things, huge show bills. But sometimes there's just such a reluctance to actually step back and acknowledge that their bodies aren't machines, and sometimes they do need a bit of a break from the extra load. And, you know, as people, we're rarely ever symmetrical or super fit, or even, you know, in the way we're utilizing our bodies. Even if we're built more symmetrically, we have strength. So, you know, we don't always know if we're pulling on the left rein or heavy in the right seat bone, or, you know, doing things that are also impacting and preventing them from healing. You know? How often, like, do you find that the rider biomechanics sort of tie in to the equine biomechanics in that way, and that it can be really challenging when you've got two imperfect bodies, which, you know, we're all imperfect in various ways, but, you know, how much does that impact the whole picture?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it goes back to considering, you know, like what could be affecting the horse's movement, and there's so many different factors, and I think that factor doesn't get looked at often enough, right? So it's typically, you know, just, does a horse need more training, or are they in pain? You know, like those are like two things that people consider a lot. But then like not some more personal factors.
And you know, I'm curious. You mentioned, you know, is it training or this? How often do you find that these underlying issues are, you know, or I guess, how often is it a training issue or a behavioral issue? You know, I hear a lot of people commenting on the horse's attitude. Oh, he's just a jerk, or this, that, and the other thing. And how often do you see that it's an actual training issue versus a discomfort related issue?
Well, I mean, I'm not a trainer, so I don't,
of
you
course,
know.
Of course,
for sure. But I can speak to my side of things where, I have gone to see some horses, and there are, you know, quote unquote behavioral issues, where, you know, the horse is stopping at jumps, or bucking, or just super agitated, irritated, biting, you know, those sorts of things. And when I go into those situations, I'm always digesting that information, and I know there probably is some sort of discomfort, some sort of physical cause. And then, I do see those behaviors get better as we move through a few sessions. And so to me, I've seen an association with the behavioral issues and physical discomfort, and I've seen those resolved through treatment. And so on my side of things, like, that's all the proof I need, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, we have to acknowledge too that horses want to be at peace. They want to find comfort. And so they're not purposefully trying to, you know, act out and ruffle our feathers. You know, like they're really just communicating, and they're wanting us to listen to them. And so often we don't. So often they really do get ignored. So like, I would say, if a horse is really speaking up and, you know, that communication is coming up in a behavior, then you have to listen. You can't just write it off as them being a certain way, you know, because that's just their way of communicating with us. They're just trying their best.
Or being a training issue. You know, I fully agree. You know, and in that vein, what are, you know, some simple things that riders can do to either recognize that their horses may be in discomfort, or to help support their horses between treatments? What are some recommendations you would make for that?
So I would say just observing your horse. You know, like, we love to just get to the barn and tack out, do what we want, you know, put the horse away. We see that really often. But how much of that time is actually spent observing your horse and really tuning in with them to see how they're feeling? Because, you know, every day they're going to be responding differently. Like, even if you're grooming them, or when you go to halter them, right? Like, it starts right there. Like, how are they reacting when they see you? Do they seem willing to engage? And then how are they when you're tacking up and you're grooming, do they have reactions? Are they a little bit more wary or sensitive, you know? One thing you can do is just get used to like palpating your horse's body. So do like a little bit of hand grooming. You don't need to always use the brush, but just get a sense for how their tissues feel and how they react, right? So look at their facial expressions, seeing if there's any tension that develops as you pass over certain areas. So just like really spending a few extra minutes here and there to get to know and to understand your horse. So then you can really pick up on signals like earlier than anyone else, right? If you develop that connection with them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, you know, one thing that I talk to people about all the time that they, you know, often say, oh, I had no idea. If you just run your hand over your horse slowly with no real pressure, you can feel distinct differences in the level of tension in that surface tissue. And so that in and of itself, it's such a simple thing. You know, we might pat them, we might scratch them, but do we ever just take the time to slowly move over them? And most of us are never taught that, but that can give us so many hints about where they're holding tension, where they might need support, why they're having a difficulty under saddle in this area or that. And then it also gives us a lot more information to share with professionals like yourself or the chiropractor or the vet when they come out to do an assessment. And I think that's so key.
And then the more that you listen to your horse, if you show them that you're there listening and you want to hear what they say, then they'll show you in more subtle ways, right? So a lot of horses will like try to actually shut down their communication with us because they're like, oh, what's the sense? Like my human isn't listening anyways. But then if you show them that you're there and you're there to support them and you are listening to those subtle cues, then they'll start to communicate more with you. And that can be a really nice development in the relationship.
And what are, you know, if people are looking at it through your lens, you know, what are some things that you wish they knew, or what are some of those subtle cues that you often see people totally miss or misread?
Well, I think what I wish people knew from my lens, I think that ties back really well to what we were just talking about, right? Like just the observing, you know, like that's what I'm trained in. I'm trained in observing the horse from right when I first set my eyes on them to, you know, through movement, through active and passive assessment. And so, and also from that emotional, psychological perspective that we consider as osteopathic practitioners as well, right? So I'm trying to see the whole horse and understand what their experience of life is. So I think that would be just so beneficial if more people could develop that perspective and just really see the horse for who they are as a being, right? So just changing your relationship with your horse a little bit that way.
I love that. And, you know, I think for anybody listening, I always like to tie in practical things. So, you know, for example, if you want to give them a bath, you know, that seems like a nice thing to do to pamper the horse, but maybe they're stressed and, you know, the whites of their eyes are showing, they don't want to walk into the wash stall, they're pawing, they're agitated. You know, those are all key kind of cues that we often misread. Oh, they're just like that. Oh, they're just high strung, you know, and we kind of dismiss them, but those are, you know, some key things that horses will do to communicate. And sometimes what we might think is nice for them, or we might assume is pampering, may not be, and it's going to be different for every horse, and sometimes even different from one day to the next. And you know, I often tie it to, if we think about when we get out of bed, some days we wake up with aches and pains, some days we wake up feeling great, sometimes we're impacted by the weather, if we have arthritis, and just starting to look at them in that way, I think could be so beneficial. You know, if they're coming out and they're stiff, why mimight that be? Like, we'll get some of the variables around that. Or if they come out one day and they're more stressed than usual, what might be the cause of that? Is it environment? Are you coming in really hot and heavy? Because I think so often what I also see is we don't understand the impact that we're having on the horses because we aren't necessarily even in tune with ourselves. You know, we might be carrying a lot of stress or anxiety, we're in a rush.
Yeah.
You know, we have,
Totally.
as people, we have
Yeah.
so much on our plate.
Yeah.
And I think that's such an important thing.
Yeah.
If we can all even just take a breath when we get to the barn and tune in a little bit to ourselves, our body.
Yeah.
Am I feeling anxious? Am I rushed
Yeah.
because I'm late for my lesson? Am I stressed because I just sat in traffic? And then think about doing some of those same kind of check-ins with your horse. And, you know, I found that that can be really helpful for people to just start building the connection in the partnership, but also having a better understanding of where they're at and how they might be contributing to those situations in a way that they didn't necessarily understand before.
Yeah, there's so much to consider in approaching each situation with the curiosity, right?
Yes, I love that.
You said a couple times there, like, why is it happening, you know? And so that's the curiosity, so approaching it with that lens versus judgment.
Yes, or blame, you know, or guilt, you know, and I think it's hard sometimes not to feel one of those, but I love that you said that, because I am just, I'm an ever curious person, and I really just want, even through this podcast, I want people to get curious, because there's so much we don't know or understand. And the trouble is, I think when we have a lack of understanding, we're automatically kind of set up for failure, and therefore we can set them up for failure without ever knowing it. But if we start to get curious about why they're doing it without making the assumption that they're being bad, or that they're just cranky, or that we suck, or whatever, it really opens so many doors to a better understanding and a better overall relationship.
Absolutely. Just yesterday I was working with a mare, not as part of an osteo session, but just at one of the farms that I visit and do some work with the horses there, like groundwork and some fun liberty work and stuff.
Nice.
And we had done some really nice work on the ground, and we were practicing some flexion exercises just with like really, really light pressure on the rope. So just seeing like how sensitive we could get her response, right? And so she was bending really nicely to the right, but she just wasn't bending to the left. But earlier in the session, she was. And I'm like, okay, like why isn't she responding to my rope, like going to the left now, but the right is super easy. So I was curious, right? I brought in that mindset. I was like, why is this? And I just got the feeling from her that she just wanted to go back to see her friends, and her friends were to the right. Right? Okay. So every time I tried bringing her head around to the left, she was pulled it back to the right. I was like, oh, she's telling me she wants to go back to her friends. And as soon as I made that decision, she happily was like, yes, let's go back. Like, that's what I was telling you. And so that's just one of those instances where I really was figuring out what this meant in the context that we were in, versus, you know, I need to use more pressure. Like, why isn't she listening? But she was just like, I did it a couple of times before, and now I just want to go back and see my friends, you know? And I was like, okay, that's the answer for today, and that's gonna build our relationship because I listened to her, right? So,
oh, I love that.
It was pretty funny. It was a really good learning moment.
It is, and you know, just ties so nicely into all the things that we talked about, and I think just our lack of understanding that they're their own beings, and so we so often misinterpret their behavior as being rude or disrespectful or not listening, and we do tend to increase the amount of force or pressure we're using, but also we often, as people, you know, we're pretty linear thinkers, and you know, we're predators. And so we tend to just go straight for what we see a lot of the time and not understand some of the nuance around it. And, you know, seeing your horse as a being, you know, with a whole life outside of the maybe 1 or 2 hours that you see them in a day is huge, because yes, they are going to have ties to things like their food or their friends, or, you know, fear around different areas. And, you know, we can't train fear, and we can't train attitude. You know, if they're showing us something and that's their personality, like if we're trying to train it out of them, we're really just deadening their communication and ensuring that they're not going to tell us things in the future, versus you opened the door for communication, which, and a lot of people think that's a slippery slope. Oh, they're never going to listen. They're always just going to think they can go back to their friends. But what I see is that it actually creates a respectful dynamic where
Yeah.
they know that we are listening and respecting them. And it creates this bond where they are willing to do for us because we are willing to do for them.
Exactly.
And we trust one another, and we are in it as a team as opposed to a dictatorship. And I think that makes a huge difference in their quality of life, their mental health, and you know, given how you've discussed all the interconnectedness of those systems, that matters. Like, we have the ability to make a huge difference in our horse's day by being, you know, something bright and positive and loving that they can really be excited about. And I see people missing that opportunity just because they don't necessarily understand the way the horses communicate.
Yeah, I think it's so important. Like, one question that you could ask yourself, you know, when at the end of the day, when you're putting your horse away, like, did my horse have fun today? Right? Did they enjoy that session? Because going back to what you said, you know, I listened to that mare in that instance. She felt like she was finished with the session. I'm like, okay, you know, like, we ended on a positive note. I didn't force her to be there. And so now she has that memory of us doing some things in the ring that were fun, and then when she wanted to go back, she could. And so that's a positive memory for her versus me making her do more and then she leaves not feeling positive because it's not what she wanted. Right? So always considering, did your horse have fun? Did they enjoy it? And then that also goes back to the physical comfort as well. If you're struggling and, you know, you're riding your horse and it's just full, you know, the session is full of tension, you're kicking and pulling and things just aren't working, they're not smooth, then how is your horse going to leave feeling well? Right?
Well, and you're probably both going to leave feeling terrible because if it's supposed to be a partnership, you know, it's nice to really approach it with that mindfulness, because I think, again, unfortunately, as linear thinkers and riders, we're so often taught, and the way we do things in our day-to-day lives is like, it's our prerogative, you know, and in horses, it's our way or the highway. So if they don't abide by exactly what we want, when we want, how we want, there's typically discipline for them, as opposed to it being a partnership where we have a conversation about what's going on, because they're not necessarily resisting to be resistant. They're resisting because they're having discomfort, or there's a fear response, or there's something else underlying that, you know, I love to kind of help people find some intunement with, because, or attunement with, because it is so important to, again, I think, for us to have a good experience and for them to have a good experience, because if we're constantly misjudging what they're doing or why, we're not having fun either. And so much of the sport ends up not being fun for people because we're kind of drilling something, but without taking into account that our partner isn't on board. And so we're kind of like a nagging partner that's irritated with our, you know, our spouse, and that's not fun, versus when it can kind of be more curious, being curious about one another, being curious about ourselves and them. And what I've seen, and I'm sure you noticed this too, is then their curiosity around us really increases, because now we're listening and we're being respectful to them. So they're like, oh, well, what are you all about then? You know, that's kind of cool. That's different. And they sort of lean in. So I think it can really lend itself to so many other really positive things in training and in relationship with them.
Absolutely. It's just the same mindset for everything, right? Like having that compassion, that connection, that curiosity. It's just affects so many different areas of the horse world.
It really does. It really, really does. Well, I know we've got to wrap up for today, but and I think we could keep talking forever. So I would love to have you back. And great. Can you just share with the audience where they can find you on social media, especially as you do your rebrand? Because we want them to be able to get on board with all the things that you're sharing.
So it's Wild Coast Equine on both Facebook and Instagram.
Amazing.
And then I have Wild Coast Performance on Instagram only for the time being, and that's more my strength and conditioning and kinesiology work. So I've kind of separated that out. So I have an equine specific and then the strength and conditioning.
Wonderful. And so applicable to riders. You know, if there's anything else I can encourage riders to do is, strengthen and be aware of their own body and how that's impacting some of the things that they or their horses are struggling with, because it's huge. We're all imperfect and uneven in different ways and have different levels of strength and handedness, and to be aware and training to best support ourselves in the saddle as well as our horses, I think makes a big difference.
Yeah, exactly.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it, and we'd love to have you on again.
Yeah, thanks so much. That was really great.
All right, take care. Thanks so much, everybody, for listening, and we will talk to you in the next episode.